Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore the logical implications of free will. With me is Dr. Reza Jorjani, who is the author of Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, and novel Folklore. Welcome again, Jason.
Good to be with you again, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Free will is something that scientists and philosophers have been arguing about now for hundreds of years. And there are still those who maintain that free will is impossible because scientific determinism shows that every action has a prior cause, and therefore we cannot exercise free will. We're constantly, everything we do is completely conditioned.
I think that scientists actually don't give enough thought to the problem of free will or the question of whether they have any, because if they were genuinely convinced that this mechanistic, reductionistic paradigm that they operate on the basis of were legitimate, I think that they would despair of getting up in the morning and continuing to pursue their research. Based on what goal in life would they be motivated to pursue a career in science if, in fact, we have no intentions whatsoever? I mean, the question of free will is not just a question of really evident actions in the world. Even to coherently pursue a line of thought involves a degree of intentionality that presupposes free will.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we have no control over our thoughts at all.
That's right. I mean, thoughts would just be something that happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something profoundly absurd about that, because we take our trains of thought to have meaning and to lead to various discoveries and developments. And all of that would be completely senseless if we did not have any free will, if our actions were either thoroughly determined or to some extent random. And that's also a very important point in terms of engaging the question of free will in the context of the scientific community.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not as if the replacement of a thoroughgoing determinism under the Newtonian paradigm with a degree of statistical randomness after quantum mechanics
mm-hmm.
is a change in the structure of knowledge that is going to give you free will.
Well, I've discussed this, of course, with other philosophers and thinkers who would put it this way. They would say, yes, randomness doesn't give you free will, but at least it allows for the possibility of free will.
On the minority interpretations of quantum mechanics that allow for psi ability to influence the indeterminism in the cosmos at a quantum level, that may be the case. But the standard interpretations, the various standard interpretations of quantum mechanics, are really a mechanics. It's just that they involve a degree of statistical probability and statistical randomness rather than the ironclad determinism of the Newtonian world.
Right.
And, if you were to interpret a person's actions as partly determined, in which case he has no free will, and partly or completely random, in that case as well he has no free will. A person whose actions are entirely random is not a person who has goals, who is pursuing them in a coherent way, and whose life can be taken to have the internal coherence that would ascribe motive and intentionality to his actions.
Mm-hmm.
So pure randomness or randomness augmenting determinism is not going to give you the structure of intentional behavior that we could legitimately describe as free will.
Well, another word for purpose or intention is teleology.
Exactly.
And scientists, for the most part, I think there are some exceptions. Scientists would say there's no room for teleology in science.
That's really the core of the problem. Aristotle makes a point of demonstrating how telos is fundamental to human life, and how a person is motivated by certain goals and also driven by experiences that have happened uniquely to them, and their cultivation of their character involves a certain interpretation of those experiences and a pursuit of certain life goals in a way that's consistent with a personality that's developed over time. And that's not at all compatible with the view of human action as the outcome of random events on a quantum level. Of course, it's also not compatible with the old school determinism operating on subatomic particles and in accordance with deterministic laws of nature. So it really is a problem of teleology and of how purpose could play a role in nature.
Now, there are branches of science, though, that cut right through all of that. One of my advisors when I was a graduate student was C. West Churchman, a well-known systems theorist who was part of the School of Management at the University of California. And he would say that management science has never had a problem with purpose or teleology. They have assumed it right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, this would take us potentially into a discussion of the structure of the various sciences and how they're interconnected with each other, which maybe is a road that we don't want to go too far down. But
we'll have that conversation another time.
But it's worth mentioning that sure, there are whole sciences that integrally presuppose purpose and an analysis of motivations and intentions. I mean, sociology is incomprehensible without it, for example. Even the most deterministic theories about how societies are organized and how they transform presupposes some degree of human intentionality. But the problem is that the various sciences have been hierarchically arranged in a way that makes fundamental physics determinative of the overall structure of scientific knowledge.
The idea of reductionism.
Right. So everything is reducible ultimately to the dynamics of physics. And it's presumed, at least tacitly, that these other explanations, biological, psychological, sociological, are more superficial, and that the ultimate laws at work there would be physical laws if we only had an intelligence and analytical capability up to the task.
Well, maybe we need to challenge that reductionistic model. I know another philosopher, a friend of us both, Stephen Browdy, would say that a psychological perspective, a sociological perspective, biological perspective are all equally valid, that physics doesn't get priority.
I would certainly agree with that, and I've argued that in Prometheus and Atlas. But what I've also argued is that you will need a different physical model. In addition to restructuring the relationship between the sciences so that it's not a hierarchical one, or if it is a hierarchical one, a structure of scientific knowledge where psychology, let's say, is more fundamental than physics.
That would be very interesting. Now, you also argue, however, that in addition to free will being incompatible with Western science as we know it, it's also incompatible with theological notions concerning an omniscient and omnipotent deity.
Yeah, what I find really disturbing is that, you have two basic categories of people in our contemporary world, and one group can be loosely defined as secular individuals who defer to the established scientific paradigm. And the other group are religious individuals who, by and large, have faith in one of the revealed religions. And if they don't, the single largest group of people who believe in a religion other than Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are Hindus.
Mm-hmm.
And in both the cases of the revealed Abrahamic religions and in the case of Hinduism, you have the conception of an all-knowing and all-powerful God,
Mm-hmm.
an omniscient and omnipotent deity. And such an entity does not allow for free will. The concept of such an entity is logically incompatible with free will. Because if you think about it, an all-powerful God has all the power in the world.
Yeah.
The human individual does not add anything to the cosmos. No action is ascribable to a particular person. All of the effective action in the cosmos is the action of this all-powerful being.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of God's omniscience, if there were an all-knowing entity, it would mean that the mind's eye of such a God was already capable of surveying all future events.
Mm-hmm.
And this means that our cosmos and any other parallel worlds would be a closed nexus of possibilities that will inevitably be actualized over the course of time,
Yeah.
which means that we as individuals, any one of us as an individual, never creates anything, never brings anything into being that wasn't already determined to be actualized.
Right.
And so faith in an all-knowing and an all-powerful God is also incompatible with free will. And this means that we've got a majority of people on the face of the earth, either secular, scientifically inclined people, or religious believers in one of these religions, who deny that they have any fundamental freedom. That, to me, is profoundly problematic.
Well, they probably, if you ask them, though, they would simply say, well, I have freedom, but these other things are also true, that they don't, most people don't claim to be logically consistent.
Yes, but you have to ask a deeper question about why it is that the majority of people on Earth don't believe they have any fundamental freedom, at least tacitly. Why do they hold beliefs that implicate the fact that their lives are either determined or random?
Well, everybody lives under a law of some kind, and virtually every legal system presumes free will. It's basic to every system of law.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you would think that, the denial of free will would render a criminal justice system incoherent.
Yeah.
But then, of course, in the Abrahamic religions, we have the notion that God is all-powerful, and therefore God is responsible for everything that happens, and yet you will be judged for your actions, and if you're a sinner, you'll burn forever in hell.
Yeah.
Well, that's very inconsistent.
Well, and certainly there's this powerful passage, I think of it as powerful, in the book of Exodus, where they say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So Pharaoh isn't even responsible for the persecution of the Jews. God is hardening his heart in order that God can show his great power.
Absolutely. I point that out in Prometheus and Atlas.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me, and I discussed this in 2 essays in Lovers of Sophia. There are 4 essays, I think, in that anthology that are relevant to the problem of free will. And in a couple of them, which interestingly are analyses of films. They're analyses of 2 films. One, The Adjustment Bureau, and the other, the film Minority Report. And these are both based on works by Philip K. Dick.
Oh, yes.
Short stories by Philip K. Dick.
Yeah.
And
where he deals in Minority Report with the issue of precognition and free will.
Yes, well, and particularly, we were talking about the criminal justice system, right?
Yeah.
And so Minority Report is about a relatively near future, where psi phenomena have been recognized by mainstream science, and precognitive remote viewing is being used to apprehend criminals before they've committed a crime.
Yeah.
And there's a question of whether these people are really determined to carry through with this crime, or whether they actually have free will.
Yeah.
And the most interesting thing, which maybe I would like to come back to later on, is the possibility of changing what was a predicted future outcome, given that one has knowledge of it. But the point I wanted to make with respect to Minority Report and the Adjustment Bureau is that it occurs to me that if you have a planet full of people who subscribe to beliefs that tacitly deny them any metaphysical freedom, that would be a planet where it would be very easy to imprison people. I mean, the first thing that you would want to do to an entire population before you imprisoned them is to shatter their fundamental faith in their own spiritual freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the Adjustment Bureau, we have a vision of an angelic bureaucracy led by a god who's a chairman.
Mm-hmm.
And this angelic bureaucracy has a plan for the world that involves, the actions of particular individuals. But these actions are all being determined by this divine bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
Except, like any other bureaucracy, it's not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is the possibility to resist the system as a whole and to assert one's metaphysical freedom.
Well, I know the philosopher Spinoza has dealt with this issue quite a bit, and it's something of a paradox because he seemed to say that we have the free will to accept that we are completely determined.
Yeah, I see that as symptomatic of, the attempt to process mechanistic materialism in the wake of Descartes,
Mm-hmm.
where, Descartes gives us this really compelling, in some ways, powerful account of a mechanistic universe, including the human body as a cog in that machinery.
Yeah.
And people like Spinoza and other thinkers in the wake of Descartes are trying to understand what that means in terms of the human soul
Mm-hmm.
and the human mind. And I think that a lot of their responses are inadequate,
Mm-hmm.
and that you don't see successful grappling with this problem until you get to people like Hegel and Schelling and other German idealists. But one thing that I wanted to talk about in this regard is that in terms of Spinoza and his metaphysics and the way in which it denies free will. Is that, William James's metaphysics, from Prometheus and Atlas onwards throughout my various writings, has seemed to me to be the most compelling understanding of the fundamental nature of reality
Mm-hmm.
that affords us free will.
Well, he's certainly among my favorite philosophers.
His vision of a cosmos constituted by independent forces
Mm-hmm.
That are struggling with one another to define reality,
Mm-hmm.
to weave the world
Mm-hmm.
structure, is, I think, the kind of metaphysics you would need for there to be free will. Because you see, when we talk about the logical implications of free will, logic goes back to the Greek concept of logos,
Mm-hmm.
which means the fabric or texture of the cosmos.
Yes.
And so you need a logos that is not a completed matrix of logical possibilities. Whether it's in the case of scientific materialism or whether it's in the case of religious belief in an omniscient and omnipotent God,
Mm-hmm.
the real problem is a conception of cosmic order that involves a completed logical matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And James's ontology doesn't face this problem because its starting point is a plurality of independent forces that only in struggle with one another bring the cosmos into being.
Mm-hmm.
And that affords us the opportunity to add to the world, to be genuinely creative agents, contributing to the co-constitution of the cosmos.
It sounds also, to me, what you're saying is compatible with the polytheistic religious traditions.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And one somewhat more sophisticated and more difficult dimension of this to grasp is that, and I discussed this in one of the essays in Lovers of Sophia, is that if there are many parallel universes,
Mm-hmm.
in the event that we are unable to engage with those other universes, it's also the case that we have no free will.
Oh.
Because in an infinity of parallel universes, or in an immeasurable number of parallel universes, where we have doppelgangers whose lives unfold in ways that are each slightly different from our own.
Yes.
That means that at every significant juncture of our lives, and many other far less significant ones, we have taken every other possible course of action that we could have taken but didn't in our own lives.
That would be consistent with what the Everett Graham Wheeler vision of cosmology. That's one version of the multiple universe
That's
theory.
right, and that is a denial of free will, if you ask me, because it reduces human decision to absurd meaninglessness.
And I know it's a popular idea amongst many physicists, but there are also other multiple worlds.
Right, and the one that I
theories.
engage with in Lovers of Sophia in particular is a more logical conception of a plurality of worlds that comes from David Lewis. He wrote a book that's very popular in analytic philosophy circles on the plurality of worlds. And to make a very long story short, it involves the idea that the basic problem in logic of what it means to use counterfactuals. Because every statement has to have, when analyzed in its fundamental logical structure, every statement has to have reference. And where are the reference in counterfactual statements? Because they aren't in this world.
Right.
And so Lewis claims that, well, this is coherent. We don't have to appeal to imaginary worlds or anything like that, because what's going on in counterfactual reference is reference to states of affairs in other worlds than our own. It's just that we can't get to them.
Yeah.
But, that would mean, as in the case of the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, that every other possible course of action that we could have taken has been taken by some counterpart of ours in another possible world, which reduces human action and choice to absurdity.
Absurdity because why is that absurd?
Part of what it means to have free will. Again, free will is not just randomness. It's not just acting in a way that you didn't make me act. It's acting in a way that is an expression of my developing personality in response to experiences that I've gone through.
Right.
Okay? And that presupposes that I'm determining my life.
Yeah.
That, in a way, my life is an act of creation. And if I've done, and creation is always exclusive, and any artist understands this, that to create a work of art, to fashion a sculpture in a particular way, or paint a painting in a particular way rather than another way, right? And to repeatedly repaint a canvas because you're trying to get it right, is an exclusionary act. It can't be that you have made every choice that you precluded during the course of that act of creation. Okay, so what this would mean is that if there are parallel worlds, for us to retain some kind of creative responsibility for our lives, we would need to be able to access those worlds. And our various counterparts would need to be able to interact with each other in ways where their lives beyond that point include possible actions, include unforeseen developments.
Well, maybe we do interact with them in our dreams, or maybe they don't exist at all, or maybe the logic in which you say A and B can't both coexist because they contradict each other, that there's something wrong with that logic.
Yeah, to take it back to logic, and in fact, this is exactly what I think is the case. David Lewis makes a remark on the Plurality of Worlds where he says that this kind of logic, where either A or B have to be the case, it has to be presumed. Okay, and this is the basis for his argument that counterfactual reference are referring to states of affairs in other possible worlds. And he says, for that not to be the case, it would mean that the world is like a story, right? I mean, you can have all kinds of possible worlds other than this actual world, but none of them is like a story. They are all internally logically consistent. And so he denies that the world could be inconsistent and revisable in the way that a story is, or have the texture of a dream, let's say.
Well, I know the physicist James Jeans once wrote that the universe seems much more like a great story than a great machine.
And I think that was also William James's view. And it's one that I've adopted in my work, and I've tried to further. And that's really what this latest book of mine, novel Folklore, is about. At the deepest level, it's about how the structure of the world, the structure of not only our world but the cosmos, is folkloric. And so our task is to revise the story of the world in a way that's more creative and constructive.
So what you're suggesting is that there's some inherent problems with the very notion of logic.
Yes, and with the hard separation between imagination and reality. Because a world that has the texture of a story, and it's important to emphasize yet again, that was the original Greek conception of logos, from which we get the word logic. And even Heraclitus still understood logos in that way, as an account or story, as the kind of narrative structure of the cosmos. And so I think that that kind of narrative structure is similar to the structure of our dreams. And it means that reality is revisable. And so our task, and this is a major theme in the works of Philip K. Dick, I mentioned Minority Report and the Adjustment Bureau, but in Philip K. Dick's corpus in general, it's a major theme that we are tasked with dreaming a better world rather than living in a nightmare.
Well, Jason Reza Jorjani, once again, a very enlightening discussion.
It was a pleasure to be with you, Jeffrey.
Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us.